Hi, everyone. So I know you've posted your videos during the weekend, and I'm going to have a look at them, but I'm away now till Thursday, so you'll probably get the feedback on Thursday. I did want to add, before we move into this week, three different sort of little insights into three different theories that might be important to you as well. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about social capital theory, social model of visibility, and ecological theory. And I'm going to try and follow the same pattern that I encourage you to take, which is talk about the major characteristics and features, the applications, the alignment with the four major paradigms, and then some of the limitations of using theory. There's always limitations because no theory is perfect. You try and find the best fit between a theory and a phenomena, but there will be often sort of critiqued limitations for each of the theory you might so choose. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail today. It's just give you an insight, but it is to keep those three theories on your radar. Why have I chosen those three? Because I find that considering the topics you've chosen, considering current sort of research priorities in education, these are three that come up quite a lot, and there's obviously more. And we can discuss that, by the way. If there's a theory that sort of tweaks your curiosity and you want to know more about it, let me know, and I can do another little sort of video expose. So social capital theory is a theory that's been quite important at the moment in educational research. It's been around for a long time. It's nothing new, but there's been a re-emergence of it with the explosion of technology around the end of the century. So it has had almost two lives, so to speak, the first round and the second round. Initially, the characteristics of social capital theory are fairly simple. It just basically asserts that an individual, when functioning in society, benefits not just from for us, not just from actual knowledge, but also benefits from the size and the richness of their network. So it seems very simple, but we need to unpack that a little bit. So considering, if you are supporting someone, the nature of how you support them is going to depend on the size of the network and the richness of that network. So funnily enough, this has been integrated into community work, social work, and even if I look at Quebec, for example, you have la loi sur la santé et les services sociaux, so the biggest piece of legislation that exists in Quebec on health and social services integrates the notion of social capital at the heart of the legislation itself. Why? Well, because if you're a social worker supporting someone, the assessment of your intervention is going to depend on the richness and the extent of the networks. If you are not going to provide the same kind of support to someone who is newcomer to Canada, isolated, has no family, hasn't quite yet got a job and doesn't have those networks existing, or whether you are supporting a client who has extended family, extended network, extended work networks, they are going to be relying on very different things. So the nature of what you provide is going to be very different. That's why it's been very, well integrated into health and social work literature and practice, and it's been around really for decades. We are now starting to be more interested in it in schools where the latecomers is field, and it's taken too long, in my eyes, for us to realize that social capital is important in schools, and we are key in the development of social capital or the hindrance of social capital. What do we, why is it so difficult for people in education to accept? Well, because we've had an over-focus on knowledge, right? And now we're starting to deconstruct that with constructivism, social constructivism. But we've been very focused on this notion of transfer of knowledge, that's what we're there for. So now schools, as said in the literature, are just starting. I mean, the literature is literally 10 years old, starting to realize that, in fact, in schools, we don't just provide knowledge, but we provide social capital. And at least we have grounds for the development and growth of social capital. And that's going to be very important to students in later life, because it is not money, but it is just as important in terms of resources that helps them function and integrate society. Examples that you often see on videos: you leave school, you want to start a business. Well, the people that you know and the resources you have access to will depend on the richness and the extent of the network. So normally there are two qualities to the network. as I said, its size and its richness. They're interdependent because there's no point having an extended network if it's of very poor quality. So essentially, when you're working on developing social capital for students, you're hoping to focus on both aspects. So an extended network and a rich networks, because that's when it starts producing and yielding results and outcomes for the person that's center of the network. Although it's taken too long for educational settings to acknowledge the fact that yes, we are very much a key important sort of locus in the creation of social capital. Parents themselves have known for a long time. I would argue, why do you think people are willing to pay phenomenal amounts of money for private education? Is the quality of education in private schools that different than it is in public school? Certainly not to the level, to the degree that would be symbolized by the size of the tuition fees. But what parents are very aware, and they've been aware for centuries, is that a student in these environments is able to gain much more social capital than in public schools, and those networks yield immediate results when the student enters society and seeks employment. So it's been on the consciousness and on the radar of parents for decades. So applications of social capital in research. I'm not going to give you a specific example, but I'm going to give you a good overview of what you see out there. Well, first of all, it's the key argument for all inclusive policies in North America, certainly. There are various arguments for the promotion of inclusion. One's philosophical, that we should have the classroom look like society, should be representative of the diversity that we see in society, because it prepares all stakeholders to address, to navigate and deal with diversity. That's usually what we call the philosophical approach. And that is included in what we call the Salamanca Statement, which is a UNESCO declaration that was signed by all members countries way back in the 80s. So that's the philosophical approach. Then we have a human rights approach, which to say, every person has the right to free and universal education, and that there should be no barriers in that access to education. So that's the human rights approach. And there are others, but the next one is social capital. The notion that really we should not segregate students in segregated schools, segregated classroom. We should not be doing ability grouping, because in fact, students need to benefit from opportunities to develop their social capital. And for that, they have to be able to interact and be around all of the students that are in their school or in their classroom. So that argument is very important. It really is responsible for, beyond school, for the closures of all segregated environments through the 80s. And that's been a policy in most global North countries. So if you see what's called deinstitutionalization in terms of mental health services and a shift to community support, the closure of segregated schools, so schools for the blind, school for the deaf, school for special needs school, that follows from the same principle. The key argument for all of that deinstitutionalization and desegregation has been social capital. The other two arguments being also evoked, but the major argument being that you cannot offer the same degree of social capital development if people are locked away in environments where they don't have full access to the full diversity of the population. So it's very important. It's central to a lot of research being done currently on inclusion, and you'll see it as a theoretical paradigm. Beyond that, there's now, obviously, technology has bumped this up. As I said, it's given it a second life, because with social media and interaction, all of, one of the paradigms that's behind that is the fact that, yes, we are creating social capital. Now, we can be quick to demonize the superficiality. And again, social capital theory acknowledges that dichotomy, because it doesn't say we have to have wide networks. We have to have wide networks and rich networks. So obviously it's going to acknowledge the fact that a lot of we develop on social media is not rich networks, but it also gives us a window to examine phenomena by which, for example, yes, you have a huge number of social media contacts, but there are now very quantifiable processes by which we know that a percentage of these will actually become face-to-face contacts. And that's very important, because however wide and superficial that large group might be, a percentage of these contacts actually become real-life contacts, actually become rich members of your networks, and therefore actually do play a role in your functionality and your integration into society. If you have any doubt about that, a clear example, for example, I met Denis Boudreau, who's a colleague who works in accessibility in industry in the tech world. I used to follow a conference that happens in San Diego, big accessibility conference that happens every year. And they have a back channel, a social, obviously a hashtag that allows you to follow the conversations. Never had a chance to go to the conference in San Diego, but always follow the back channel of the conference. Picked up some of the dialogue that Denis was encouraging. We followed each other, started, chatting. Eventually, we realized that actually he was also from Montreal, so therefore was, close in proximity. This is someone I ended up meeting, someone that ended up being a keynote at some of the events I've organized, and I formed this sort of professional collaboration. These are not exceptions. We know from the literature that a significant and very sort of standard, steady percentage of these connections that you make online actually become important and significant members of your networks in terms of face-to-face and reliability, and being able to yield outcomes from these networks. So a lot of the literature is going to be interested in social media from that perspective, and there's some important work being done there. And also that connects with, for example, schools' roles and support in using technology to create networks outside of them. So there's a connection with experiential learning as well. That, for example, if you want your students to integrate employment, you should create environments where they actually are able to, using virtual means and using technology, to be able to actually create those contacts before they leave, right? So you play an active role there in the development through experiential learning and with technology in the development of their networks for a real world environment they're about to enter. If you wanted more examples, I was involved on the periphery of a project at Dawson College in Montreal, which looked at, well, the first thing that is use a gaming sort of workshop to as a natural pull for students with autism on the campus. So without having to say you need to come and register for accessibility, you need to be present for support, they instead sort of approached it by saying, okay, we're going to create a gamers sort of club, and then people can join if not. And as luck would have it, a lot of students with autism that were entering the college started attending regularly this gamers club. Looking beyond that, when we look at social media use with students with autism, we realize often that when they're in high school, they actually start looking for their networks and work on the integration into college environment, and start all that work through online platforms. So they actually are very proactively developing networks in the institution of further education they're going to, and they create this proactively while they're still at school. So there's a lot of very interesting things that are happening around social capital theory. Alignment, social capital theory used to be, at the very origin, was very positivist in alignment, because it was really all about proving the universality and the validity of these principles, that we all had these networks and very quantifiable, and that they yielded very quantifiable sort of outcomes in terms of societal integration. We moved away from that, and I would say that most of social capital theory now works within a phenomenological alignment, because it's now, the theory is now fully acknowledging and embracing the fact that it's inherently a subjective process, the way you create those networks and the way you rely on them and the way you assess their richness and their usefulness. So that from that, we have seen the development of a lot of even hermeneutic dialogues around social capital. So really looking at the narrative of a single person explaining their sort of social capital and development. That would be the case for some of the students on the autism spectrum disorder going to college. But generally, yeah, it's now well grounded within a phenomenological theoretical stance. In terms of limitations, well, because it is now firmly grounded in phenomenology, some researchers will argue that it doesn't work for them because it's not something that's very quantifiable. So you're back to that phenomenology positivist sort of dichotomy, and people, feeling comfortable in one or the other, but finding it very difficult to create alliances with people working from the other camp. They all, and positivists may say it's too subjective, it's wishy-washy, it's very hard in practice to see the very precise impact that this has on social integration. So you're going to see a lot of these critiques being addressed from or targeted from the positivist camp. Okay, so that's the first one. The next one is the no connections between them at all, social model of disability. So we've had a presentation, which I've not had time to look at yet, on critical disability studies theory. And that's certainly one of the approaches. Obviously, critical disability studies theory is very aligned with critical theory, and you can see a lot of connections there. Social model of disability is different in the sense that it still tackles disability impairment, but it's really going to have an alignment. I'm going to jump here, but it's going to have an alignment that's much more linked to postmodern thought. So postmodern thought, again, the construction of discourse, is construction of social cultural representation, and that's exactly what the social model of disability will do. So what does the social model of disability argue? What are its key characteristics? Been around since the 1970s. Some key scholars in the UK, Colin Barnes, Tom Shakespeare, come to mind as being, and mostly working at Leeds. There's a very strong disability studies center at Leeds, and mostly coming out of that, most of the scholarship. But it's really a eureka moment for a lot of people. And basically what it argues is that disability is not actually an inherent characteristics of people. So it proposes a different construct, a different interpretation of what disability is. And it says that really disability isn't so much an inherent label, an inherent characteristics or feature of people, but that it is actually situated between, in the interaction between people's individual embodiment and the way we construct, design spaces, experiences, products. Usually, there's a lot of good resources here. Usually, the way to introduce the social model of disability is to actually use very tangible examples. People relate well to examples of physical impairment. So if you think of a person who is a wheelchair user, if a person lives in San Francisco and they have access to fully accessible buildings, fully accessible municipal services, fully accessible transport, fully accessible leisure, they will probably go through their day having very few perceptions of disability because they will be actually able to live exactly the same lives as other people. And so those experiences today of being disabled are not actually going to be frequent. You move that person to Montreal, where there is no accessible transport. You have to request accessible, individualized accessibility mini shuttles, where a lot of buildings are still not accessible, where you certainly are not going to have accessible leisure spaces. And that person is going to be confronted with a perception of disability continuously during the day. So usually people really get the social model of disability when you look at physical impairment, and then you can obviously transfer that to any other disability. So again, if you think of a student in school, but I'm going to take example of higher education because then students advocate more, and this is actually discussed. When I worked in accessibility at McGill, a student would register for accessibility if they had ADHD, for example. Diagnosed disability supposedly hinders accessibility to learning, has documentation, has funding, has access to certain support services. Now, in fact, in practice, if you work with the disability services, accessibility services, the students with ADHD, you don't see them all the time. You see them at very sporadic times within their 4-year degree. They can come in and have disastrous issues with their course, perform really badly, but then you may not see them again for a year. And then they come back in, and then it happens again. So how do we explain that fluctuation? Well, from a social model perspective, what you actually see in the way of the lens that it gives you on this is that depending on what teaching and learning format they actually are confronted with, if it's an active learning classroom where the roles change often, there is no 3-hour lecture, assessment is formative and has been diversified. In these environments, they do well. In fact, if you look at their transcripts, you actually see them outperforming their peers. And then if they eventually return to a course that they cannot avoid, where it's a 3-hour sit-down lecture, passive role, summative assessment in the form of finals, very little diversity and differentiation, then they do really, really badly, and then they need a lot of support. So this is another example to make people now shift onto other forms of disability and really see the impact of the environment. The disability is not ADHD. The disability is when a person with ADHD finds himself in an environment that's only designed and formatted in one way, and then they cannot function. A lot of these same students will eventually end up in, there's a direct link now in the literature of people with ADHD actually doing extremely well in the industry, often being in corporate position, leadership positions, because the skills that are required there fit their embodiment perfectly well. There's no clash, no friction, no perception of disability. So there you have another example. The social model of disability is extremely powerful, both for the educator and for the student themselves. For the student, it's freeing because suddenly the problem is not them. The problem is actually the design of the space or the learning experience or the resource. So suddenly they're able to not internalize this perception of disability, but actually it is here, it's physically here in front of me, it's in that interaction and in that design. For the educator too, it's extremely powerful because suddenly you stop seeing the student as the problem and diversity as being the exception, but you understand that diversity is all around us, and therefore you have a role. You are actually the person who has control of as the controls. And the way you design your instruction, the way you design your choice of resources, the way you design that learning experience or the assessment, it's going to have a direct impact, which can support the learner, integrate all diverse learners, or can disable them and make them feel like they don't fit in. It's not designed for them. So it's powerful for both sides. Without spending too long, in terms of applications, so there's a lot of applications, obviously, of it around inclusion. If you look at really the way we have deconstructed and eliminated the notion of special needs and special education in the K-12 system in Canada and North America, that's very much based on a social moral approach. If you look at the original intention of the IEP, although now the IEP is becoming a catastrophe because we have firmly pushed it back into a medical model perspective, but originally the IEP actually emerged as a sort of part of the No Child Left Behind policies, legislation in the US. And actually, if you look at the essence of the IEP, it's a just-in-time document that is rewritten every semester that allows the student in the first person to express the places, the areas where they are actually experiencing barriers, and for the team together to design in a way that enables them not to be bouncing against these barriers, to be experiencing these barriers, so finding ways, strategies to erode these barriers. So the essence of the IEP is actually very much social model sort of inspired. But as is the case often in education, we are faced with principles of pendulum. So, we swing one way and then the status quo of institutions wants to swing back to something that doesn't disturb the status quo. And that's called systemic theory. That's what we see, organizations flipping back. That's what's happened with the IEP. So this extremely progressive social model tool has now been sort of re-owned and repurposed by the medical model approach, which now it's become a document of often vehicles, diagnostic information, which is not supposed to. It's actually written in by the school, the teacher, or the support services, but it's not actually in the first person written by the student, and it doesn't really target barriers. Instead, it falls back to this notion: you have a diagnosis, this is what we're going to do about it. But there's a lot of original work around the IEP in the 1980s that was very much social model based. Everything that I do in UDL is basically based on the social model, because it's basically that. It's actually saying the problem is not the student, the problem is actually the instructor. If you design in an inclusive way, you reduce the pressure on the student to have to disclose and to request retrofitting and things like this. In terms of alignment, I've already said it's very, very much aligned with the postmodern theoretical paradigm, because really it redefines disability as being really a spectrum, fluid, and said that we're all on this spectrum. In fact, a lot of the thinking that goes behind a social model now has led to the adoption of terms like temporarily abled, because really a lot of scholars that work from social model perspective say that we have this false belief that we are that if we're able-bodied, we are autonomous, we don't require support. And they say that actually we require support when we're children, we require support when we get older. All of us will eventually use Zoom text, and we'll use on our phone, and we'll use captioning on our TV, and use probably walking aids and things like this. So they now talk about this notion of temporarily able, which again gives everyone a clear indication that beyond the constructs, beyond those labels that we have, disability, able-bodied, is actually a real fluidity there, that it's not just that we all position on the spectrum, but that we evolve on the spectrum, and that all of us actually are at times disabled, at times able-bodied. In terms of limitation, there is some high level, well, obviously there's some medical model, deficit model, insecurity and tension where people say, oh, it's, we can't move out of that. But I think you can deconstruct that, because often the argument that people have is really not about the model itself. They will argue that they are stuck in a funding model or in structures that are anchored in the medical model. And then they say you're asking them to move out of that, and they don't necessarily know how to move out of that. But that's not a theoretical limitation there. It's actually people saying, in my practice, I'm so limited by funding policies and like coding kids and things like this in school that I don't know how to move towards a social model implementation. So that's something that you hear. But the real high-level criticism about social model disability is sometimes saying that it makes abstraction of impairment, that in the end it's saying, there's no such thing. And so you have versions it doesn't exist in English, but you do have a version called the Processus de Production du Handicap, so PPH, Processus de Production du Handicap. It's been started in France, it's quite popular in Quebec, and it's a sort of adapted social model of disability, where now it doesn't just present disability as just being interactionist and in between the individual and the environment, but it talks about the triangular triad, right, where you have the impairment, the environment, and the individual. And so therefore it starts positioning things like the difference. And sometimes the PPH is celebrated for at least acknowledging the fact that, for example, if a person is in extreme pain, it doesn't matter to the extent to which you are designing in an inclusive way, they are still going to be in extreme pain, which is still going to affect their ability to integrate society. So particularly for people who are care providers or working around theory around care providers for significant disability, and for this we mean, for example, people who have chronic pain, people who are nonverbal, people who are really dealing with significant disabilities, they like the PPH more because it's yes, they like the social model, but they would like that sort of extra major impact of the impairment to still be acknowledged. And that's one of the limitations I've encountered. Okay, next, the third one is ecological theory. Ecological theory is very important to us on two dimensions. So during this section, I'm going to keep talking about two different contexts, two different dimensions. What are the key elements of ecological theory? So an author there that you will see as key is Bronfenbrenner. I think he's dead now, but he wrote until the 1980s. This isn't terribly old. And he is he's a psychologist that moved into social work. And he was particularly interested in child development and schools. And the major characteristics of the theory, you've probably seen it represented graphically. Bronfenbrenner explained that really, or argued that when we looked at child development and children in school, we should really picture the child in the middle. And then he argues that they are all these systems. So he gives them very specific names: mesosystem, all these names. You don't necessarily need to remember all the names. That's not important. The important thing is the essence of the theory, which is that by putting the child in the middle and seeing the systems that are around them, you start to acknowledge the complexity of what you see, and also that these systems interact and impact the child. So that when you're in a classroom, it's very, very important in challenging behavior, for example, then you see a manifestation that you don't understand. It encourages the educator to think it's not the child, it's not what I see in front of me, it's the result of these complex and long sort of interactions between system and the child, and also between the systems themselves. So the immediate systems would be the parents and the family and the significant teachers. Then around them you have the friends, the neighborhood, the community, and then you have wider system. And the larger systems encompass your provincial legislation, the framework within which the school works, and all of these things. So it's a great framework because it really allows you to fully acknowledge the full complexity of what's in front of you. In terms of characteristics, we've moved away now from just looking at children. And in fact, even some of Bronfenbrenner's studies were actually encouraging us to put any individual in the middle of the circle, so that really that analysis works for anyone. And particularly you yourself as a teacher within a school, you can also use ecological theory to understand why you overreact, why you have emotional reactions to certain things, why certain things make you uncomfortable. You can do the same analysis, put yourself in the middle, look at your systems, see how the systems interact with you, and understand the complexity of simply how you feel when you walk into school in the morning. And that's very important, that you have spouses, you have money problems, you have all these things. And all these things can be represented graphically in the systems around you as individual. So in terms of applications, as originally designed, looking at the child, it's been hugely important to look at the complexity of behavior, challenging behavior. But that has quickly been more complex in the sense that then when we look at when we look at bullying, for example, there's been a lot of ecological analysis around bullying. Instead of having a simplistic position where we say, oh, okay, there's a bully, we punish the bully will be fine. We know that's not the reality of what bullying is like. It's a long, sometimes transgenerational process that take place for a long time that the students don't always necessarily understand themselves. Now with ecological theory, you can do a diagram, you can have the child, the system, the child, the system. You see that the systems impact the child, but also that the systems interact between the two kids. And often that's what you see, right? Community issues between students and parents and neighborhoods and sometimes parts of town. Sometimes, but more than that, right? Your national origin, your ethnicity, and then you understand the bullying from a really complex sort of overarching diagram. Even in terms of challenged behavior, ecological has been key in a sense that when we say a kid has challenging behavior, and it encourages you as a teacher to draw the same schematic representation and understand that when you have this emotional moment where you're in the room and you think, I can't deal with that child, that it's not necessarily the child, but it's also the interaction of all your systems and all their systems. And that the tension that you feel is maybe caused by things that are much, much wider than your frame of mind that morning. It's been very, very important for that. And then, interestingly, on a different level, ecological theory now has been around for a long time. So now when you're looking at organizational and leadership issues, there's also a lot of people who are using ecological theory to understand management of change. So if you are, for example, in a school and you're trying to innovate and you're trying to trigger management of change process, you can picture yourself or the people that you're with or that community of practice that's leading the change. And you can picture all of its relationship with all of its system. And sometimes that's very useful because it enables you to understand that sometimes if you fail or if you encounter problems in management of change, it's not about the content, it's not about the agenda. It's sometimes about the interactions of the leaders of the momentum of change with all of the rest of the systems that are in operation in that organization. So very important from that as well. And that also relates to inclusion, because when I look at inclusion in schools, I tend to do that and put the advocate or the leader or the strategic stakeholder in the middle and then see how the systems around it are sometimes hindering the process. And sometimes it has nothing to do with the message, with the inclusion message. It has to do with the politics of these interactions. And that's sometimes very, very important to understand change within an institution. So in terms of applications, I've already mentioned, significant grounding in terms of studies on bullying, hugely important in terms of challenging behavior. And then beyond that, now looking at phenomena of change in schools and in terms of organizational change. The alignment, so again, this is historical. It's normal that when you look at the alignment of a theory, it might change because theory evolves. So that's what the case again with this one. Like a lot of frameworks that have evolved from psychology as a grounding and at its roots, it has evolved. So Bonfim was a psychologist, originally very interested in looking at the notion of system from a positivist angle, trying to establish universal principles that are valid and transferable to any environment. A lot of psychologists have these ambitions and then fail very quickly and realize that really it's not the appropriate lens. And so as he moved into community work and social work, and as ecological theory entered schools, now we have something that, again, is much more phenomenological. Because if you think about it, even the construct of the systems around you, it's a phenomenological interpretation. It's not the reality of the systems, it's your interpretation and your awareness and your sensitivity to the fact that these systems actually interact on you. So it's much more phenomenological now in most of the studies that you see. In terms of orientation, it's very easy for ecological theory because it's very useful. I work a lot in ecological theory. It's very, very useful in education to just create awareness around the complexity of what we deal with. It avoids a simplistic, minimalist approach to problems where we're so nose to the wall that we don't realize the complexity of what we're dealing with. But the limitations are that it doesn't provide solutions. It can be very frustrating, particularly for practitioners when you, not necessarily for researchers, but for practitioners when your outcome are produced. because it does give you a full awareness of the complexity of what you're looking at, but it doesn't actually tell you what to do. And sometimes the complexity is such that there's no easy solution. All you can do is walk and tread on eggs and veil it delicately and be aware of the whole complexity of what you're dealing with. But it doesn't give you tools. I would argue that it still gives you a tool. The tool is your awareness that there's no simple solution and you have to tread lightly. But some practitioners sometimes get frustrated with the fact that there's no checklist, there's no to-do list, there's no immediate outcome. It's really a lens on the complexity of situations that surround you in education. Okay, so these were 3 that I think you need to have on your radar because they're very, very common. And certainly my assessment would be that in contemporary educational research, they come up a lot. But there are more, right? There are hundreds of different theories now of more moderate scale than the 4. You have the 4 big one at the top, and then you go down in terms of scope and scale. There are hundreds that we use in education research, so we can't cover them all. But if there are any specific ones that you would like covered, then let me know, and I will do further little exposés like this and tackle the theories that might be useful to you in specific contexts, since you're all doing very different projects. I will speak to you shortly.